Long before capture, German soldiers carried into battle not only their rifles and rations, but also a carefully crafted belief system. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a hollow empire of indulgence. According to official speeches, America was a patchwork of immigrants too divided to stand together, a place where people chased comfort instead of discipline. German newspapers ran caricatures of Americans as lazy men sipping Coca-Cola, dancing to jazz, and wasting their lives in movie theaters, while real nations like Germany fought for destiny. To soldiers in the Wehrmacht, these ideas became a kind of armor, reassurance that the enemy lacked the steel to endure a true struggle. The narrative was hammered home endlessly. American soldiers were spoiled children of wealth, unfit for the mud and blood of war. Their factories, so the story went, produced quantity but not quality, machines mass-made by unskilled hands that would fall apart under pressure. German officers reminded their men that one Panzer was worth a dozen clumsy American tanks, that one Luftwaffe ace could scatter a squadron of amateur pilots. Pride and arrogance weren't just emotions, they were policy. By the time many Germans marched into campaigns across Europe, the image of America as a weak, selfish, and decadent society felt like truth. After all, it was easier to believe an enemy was soft than to imagine a rival could match or even surpass them. For these men, every step into combat was taken with the confidence that they represented discipline and destiny, while across the ocean Americans lived in distracted chaos. What none of them realized then was how brutally this illusion would crumble, not on the battlefield alone but at a family's dinner table thousands of miles from home. The arrogance fed by propaganda was not born in a vacuum, it was reinforced by victory. When German forces stormed across Poland in 1939 and toppled France in only 6 weeks, the following year, soldiers came to see their own system as unstoppable. Blitzkrieg was more than a strategy, it was proof that discipline, speed, and German steel could crush any opponent. Watching the once proud French army collapse so quickly, many officers concluded that America with its soft civilian soldiers would fare even worse. Victories in the Balkans and Greece only hardened this confidence. Each success seemed to confirm the story they had been told. Germany was destined to triumph, and others simply lacked the will. In North Africa, under commanders like Rommel, German troops pushed the British back and gained a reputation for tactical brilliance. Around desert campfires, young officers told each other that if Germany could drive Britain to the brink, then what chance did a distracted and distant America have? For the ordinary panzer crewman or infantryman, these triumphs became deeply personal. They saw themselves not as mere soldiers but as heirs to a rising empire. Letters home were filled with pride, some boasting that their children would grow up in a world reshaped by German power. In their minds, the idea of American weakness was not theory but certainty. With Europe falling and the desert seemingly theirs to control, many entered captivity later in the war, unable to imagine any reality other than German superiority. For the German prisoners, the journey into captivity began with an expectation of misery. They imagined cattle cars, chains, and cruelty, punishments fitting for defeated enemies. Instead, what awaited them was so strange it bordered on the surreal. When they were marched toward the trains, some braced themselves for the kind of transport they had inflicted on others. Cramped wooden wagons, no food, no dignity. What they found instead were passenger cars with padded seats, polished windows, and clean aisles. The men hesitated before climbing aboard, unsure if it was a trick. Once seated, the shock deepened. Cushions softened the weight of their bodies, and overhead lights hummed steadily, bathing the car in a warm glow. For soldiers who had spent months in the mud, living among ration tins and smoke, this felt like stepping into another world. They exchanged uncertain glances. Some even laughed nervously, unable to reconcile comfort with captivity. Then came the dining car. White tablecloths, steaming trays of food, pitchers of milk and coffee. Such abundance seemed impossible in wartime. Guards treated them not with violence but with indifference, as though feeding and transporting them humanely was the most ordinary thing in the world. For men conditioned to believe Americans were weak and selfish, the reality was disorienting. Every mile of track carried them deeper into a paradox. They were prisoners, yet being treated with a level of civility that eclipsed the lives of many civilians back home in Germany. It was here, on padded seats in a train meant for comfort rather than punishment, that the first cracks of doubt began to spread. When the trains finally slowed and rolled into small American towns, the German prisoners pressed their faces against the glass in disbelief. Outside, streets glowed with steady rows of electric lamps, casting wide halos of light onto shop fronts and sidewalks. Neon signs flickered above diners and theaters. Families strolled casually, children clutching bags of sweets, couples chatting as though war existed only on some distant horizon. For the prisoners, the sight was staggering. Back in Germany, entire cities were smothered in blackouts. Windows were painted over or draped in thick curtains. To light a candle was to risk drawing the attention of bombers overhead. Nights were silent but for the throb of distant engines, punctuated by air raid sirens and the crunch of rubble. Darkness had become part of survival. Yet here, light spilled carelessly into the streets, unguarded, uninterrupted, and abundant. The contrast gnawed at them. Some whispered that America was untouched because it had been spared bombing, but others realized it was more than that. It was confidence. These glowing streets declared security and prosperity so vast that light could be wasted without fear. Shops were stocked, movie theaters were open, and families lingered without a hint of ration-induced desperation. The prisoners sat in stunned silence, their arrogance eroding under the glow of every lamp. What Nazi propaganda had painted as a fractured, decadent society instead revealed itself as calm, thriving, and overflowing with resources. The sight left an impression deeper than gunfire, not the threat of weapons, but the casual ease of a nation at peace within itself. The German prisoners soon learned that America's power was not only visible in its glowing towns, but in its staggering ability to produce. Their first exposure came through the endless talk of Liberty ships, vessels built with such speed and efficiency that it seemed like fiction. Some of the guards casually mentioned that one had been launched after only a few days of construction. The prisoners exchanged skeptical looks. In Germany, even modest vessels required months of effort, painstakingly assembled under the constant threat of Allied bombers. Here, America was producing entire fleets before a single German shipyard could finish one. Then came the trucks. Convoys stretched for miles, rumbling along highways that cut across the land like arteries pumping lifeblood to the war. Every camp supply delivery felt excessive to the Germans. Crates of bread, cans of meat, sacks of flour. To men who had lived through rationing, this abundance felt almost insulting. In their homeland, mothers queued for hours just to receive thin slices of bread or a few ounces of meat. In America, such food seemed to arrive in mountains, unloaded with casual ease and little ceremony. The stockpiles at the camps deepened the shock. Warehouses brimming with supplies stood as silent monuments to American industry. For German soldiers conditioned to believe that Allied forces were weak and disorganized, the sight of surplus, not just enough but too much, gnawed at their pride. It was not only that America could feed its own people and its armies, it could also afford to feed its enemies generously. Every Liberty ship launched, every truck that thundered past the barbed wire, every loaf of bread stacked high, told the same truth. This was a nation whose strength lay not in slogans or propaganda, but in overwhelming tangible abundance. What unsettled the German prisoners most was not only the mountains of supplies or the fleets of ships, it was the realization that even America's ordinary workers seemed to live with a level of comfort that rivaled or even exceeded the lifestyles of German elite. They noticed it first in small details. The dock workers unloading crates wore sturdy boots and thick jackets, items that in Germany would have been scarce or reserved for officers. Lunch breaks revealed another shock. Workers casually unwrapped sandwiches stacked with meats and cheese, while some carried thermoses filled with fresh coffee or milk. To men accustomed to scraping at thin rations, the sight of laborers eating so well was disorienting. The contrast grew sharper as the POWs compared it with their own homeland. In Germany, factory laborers worked long hours in freezing conditions, often underfed and exhausted. Yet here in America, the men and women powering the war machine looked healthy, well-dressed and confident. It was not just survival, it was comfort. Even the children they glimpsed in nearby towns wore shoes that fit, coats without patches, and carried schoolbooks bound in fine covers. The message was impossible to ignore. If America's strength reached this deep into its society, if everyday workers could live with more security and dignity than many German officers, then the entire German worldview began to crumble. The POWs understood that this was not a fragile nation distracted by decadence, but one where ordinary wealth gave extraordinary power. For men who had been raised on propaganda and hardship, nothing could have prepared them for the invitation that came one quiet Sunday afternoon. Guards and local families approached the German POWs with an offer that seemed absurd. Would they like to join a family for dinner? At first disbelief overtook curiosity. These were supposed enemies, prisoners in a foreign land, and yet the Americans were offering warmth, laughter, and a seat at their tables. The POWs hesitated, uncertain whether such kindness masked a trick or inspection. But as they followed the smiling hosts into tidy homes, the surreal nature of the experience became undeniable. The aroma of roast meat, fresh bread, and simmering vegetables filled the air. Children peeked shyly from behind chairs, giggling when the prisoners nodded awkwardly in greeting. Mothers and fathers invited the men to help themselves, encouraging second and third servings. Conversation flowed naturally, with Americans asking simple questions about home, family, and life in Germany, not as interrogators but as hosts, genuinely interested in their guests. Every bite, every exchange challenged the POWs' expectations. The arrogance instilled by years of Nazi teachings collided with the reality of human generosity. Gratitude replaced skepticism, and in those first meals the prisoners began to understand a fundamental truth. The Americans did not need to humiliate, punish, or intimidate them to assert strength. They could win hearts and minds simply through decency. By the time dessert arrived, pies and puddings served with smiles, a new emotion settled over the POWs, astonished appreciation. They were learning in the simplest of ways that respect and empathy could be more powerful than the mightiest weapon. For the first time, many realized that the war might be fought not just with tanks and bullets, but also with humanity. The first steps into an American home were hesitant. The POWs, still gripping their coats and gloves from the crisp air outside, glanced around at polished floors, framed photographs, and the soft hum of conversation. Every detail seemed incongruous with the grim, disciplined life they had known. The rigid routine of barracks, the scarcity of food, the stark walls of confinement. Their nerves were taut, eyes darting, unsure if this welcome was genuine or a staged performance. Then came the smile. Children, curious and unafraid, offered shy waves and whispered greetings. Mothers poured tea and invited them to sit. Fathers cracked small jokes in careful English, leaning toward gestures and laughter when words faltered. The POWs, tense at first, began to relax in increments, each polite invitation softening the armor of suspicion they had carried across the Atlantic. As the meal progressed, the men found themselves observing the way families interacted, the ease with which Americans shared, the laughter over simple anecdotes. They were learning an entirely new language of civility and warmth, one that had nothing to do with rank, propaganda, or fear. Each bite of roast meat, each sip of milk, seemed to dissolve a layer of disbelief. Conversations grew bolder, smiles more natural. The prisoners began to respond in kind, sharing small stories of home, asking questions about life in America, discovering common threads in human experience. The atmosphere shifted from one of anxiety to cautious camaraderie. By dessert, what had begun as a nerve-wracking encounter had become a gentle revelation. The enemy they had feared was capable of generosity, humor, and humanity. The POWs left the table carrying a mix of awe and gratitude, a newfound understanding that strength could coexist with kindness. They were learning slowly but irrevocably that the heart could be a battlefield as transformative as any front line. The table was laid as if for a celebration, though it was merely a Sunday gathering. Loaves of golden brown bread, thick and fragrant, were stacked in baskets. Platters of roasted meat glistened under the warm overhead light, while bowls of creamy butter, fresh fruits, and rich desserts completed the spread. For the POWs accustomed to the rationed bread and thin soups of camp life, every item seemed almost unreal, a sudden overwhelming abundance. Hands trembled slightly as they reached for slices of bread, feeling the soft, airy texture, so unlike the coarse loaves they had known. Milk in small glass bottles, cold and fresh, ran freely across the table, a luxury they had scarcely imagined in their German towns ravaged by war. The scent of roasting meat, rich and savory, brought memories of simpler times, yet also a pang of disbelief. that anyone could live with such plenty while their families struggled back home. Conversations were cautious at first. The POWs murmured in broken English, asking for explanations, trying to comprehend the generosity. Children leaned forward, curious, offering fruit slices and sweets. Parents encouraged them, insisting that all were welcome, no matter their uniform. Each gesture reinforced the lesson. Abundance was not simply material, it was a reflection of humanity, of trust extended to those once considered enemies. Desserts arrived, custards, pies, cakes layered with cream, and the prisoners paused, staring in disbelief. They had grown accustomed to scarcity, to meals that filled the stomach but never the imagination. Here food was both nourishment and statement, a demonstration that life could be generous without expectation, that kindness could be effortless. By the time the plates were cleared, the POWs were changed. Each shared bite, each sip was a revelation. The table had become more than a place to eat. It was a space where preconceptions melted, where the power of generosity and normalcy confronted years of propaganda. They left not merely fed, but shaken, with a gut-level understanding that the world they thought they knew was far more complex, humane, and abundant than they had ever imagined. As the POWs sat at the American family tables, their eyes could not help but wander beyond the immediate abundance before them. Every plate brimming with meat, bread, and vegetables was a stark contrast to the meager rations their families endured back in Germany. Mothers and children in bombed-out towns, fathers scavenging for scraps. These images haunted the soldiers even as they chewed on tender meat or sipped creamy milk. One prisoner quietly whispered to his neighbor, "We ate like kings today while our mothers starved." Another nodded solemnly, his eyes tracing the shiny forks and glasses, the bright linens that adorned the table. The realization struck hard. This comfort, this generosity was a privilege unknown in their own home. Each bite was flavored with guilt as much as gratitude, a reminder that abundance could also illuminate the deprivation they had left behind. The conversation turned reflective. Stories of siblings eating dry potatoes, of neighbors sharing a single loaf of bread, contrasted sharply with the overflowing baskets of the American dinner. The POWs could not suppress the pangs of sadness, a deep empathy for the plight of those they loved, coupled with the unexpected kindness of those who had once been their enemies. Yet amidst the guilt, a new understanding emerged. This generosity, this ordinary human kindness, was a revelation. It was not only nourishment for the body, but also for the mind, a subtle education in compassion and dignity. They realized that even in war, the essence of humanity could shine through, and that these small acts of sharing had the power to break preconceptions, soften hearts, and plant seeds of hope in a world marred by destruction. When the POWs were invited into American homes, the welcome went far beyond a simple meal. Hosts offered coffee, fresh-baked pastries, and the morning newspapers, small ordinary details that seemed extraordinary to the soldier. For men who had lived under strict military discipline and scarcity, these gestures were astonishing. They were allowed to sit, relax, and engage in genuine conversation, something they had scarcely experienced in the regimented routines of war and captivity. One German soldier recalled the delight of holding a warm cup of coffee in his hands, inhaling the rich aroma, and listening to the soft murmur of a family discussing local news and community happenings. He had expected suspicion, mistrust, or even scorn, but instead encountered curiosity, smiles, and hospitality. Each exchange, every question asked about life back home, every story shared about schoolchildren or harvests, became a window into a world that seemed almost surreal. The conversations were gentle but probing, a subtle education in empathy and civility. POWs found themselves laughing at light-hearted anecdotes, nodding thoughtfully at family wisdom, and realizing that these ordinary interactions were extraordinary in their significance. The soldiers began to see that the simple act of offering a chair, a newspaper, or a cup of coffee was layered with meaning, respect, trust, and the recognition of shared humanity. Even small moments, like discussing a sports game or sharing a joke about a local event, carried weight. To the POWs, these gestures were more than social niceties. They were a revelation that humans could be kind even to those who had once been considered enemies. Curiosity grew into warmth, and discomfort melted into a cautious comfort, teaching lessons that no military strategy could convey. As the POWs spent more time in American homes, a deeper realization began to settle in. The kindness they were receiving wasn't obligatory, and it wasn't part of any formal rule. It was freely given. Families offered them chairs at the table, extra portions of food, or invitations to stay for a few hours, simply because they chose to, not because they were required to. This distinction struck the German soldiers profoundly. It was one thing to be fed and housed as part of camp regulations, but it was another to be welcomed as a guest, treated with genuine warmth and dignity. One soldier remembered the quiet confidence of an American father who poured him a second cup of coffee, smiled, and asked about his family back in Germany. There was no judgment, no suspicion, only a curiosity that was patient and sincere. These small acts of human decency, repeated across homes and towns, slowly chipped away at the soldiers' preconceived notions. They realized that generosity could exist without expectation, and that respect for another person's humanity was not conditional. For the viewers, this moment humanizes both sides of the war, the POWs who are learning humility and empathy, and the Americans whose ordinary gestures reflect extraordinary moral character. The contrast between coercion and voluntary kindness resonates deeply, building a subtle but powerful emotional connection. POWs began to look beyond their labels as enemy soldiers and see themselves simply as human beings deserving of trust and care. By the end of these visits, respect replaced skepticism. Laughter, shared stories, and the feeling of being welcomed in a stranger's home left an indelible impression on the soldier. They carried away not just memories of food and comfort, but lessons in human decency and generosity that no battle could teach. These experiences quietly reshaped their worldview, planting seeds of admiration and gratitude that would linger long after they returned home. As German POWs continued to experience life outside the barracks, a growing sense of cognitive dissonance took hold. Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as weak, selfish, and morally inferior. It had emphasized their decadence and framed them as incapable of discipline or courage. Yet the soldiers' direct encounters with American families began to dismantle every aspect of that narrative. They were invited into homes where children shyly offered seats at the dinner table, where mothers served generous portions of food, and fathers treated them with courtesy and curiosity. The simple act of being welcomed into someone's private space, a kitchen, a living room, a Sunday dinner, was a radical contradiction to everything they had been taught. For many POWs, this was more than surprising. It was deeply unsettling. Here were families who were technically their enemies, yet there was no malice, no suspicion, no hidden agenda. The soldiers could not reconcile the warmth, patience, and trust they were shown with the image of Americans drilled into their minds by years of propaganda. Each invitation, each small gesture, struck at the ideological foundation of their beliefs. They began to question the morality of their leaders' assertions and the validity of their own prejudices. From the audience's perspective, this section serves as a powerful hook. The shock comes not from combat or violence, but from the subversion of expectation. Watching men who were taught to despise Americans slowly confront the kindness and humanity of their supposed enemies creates an emotional and intellectual tension that keeps viewers engaged. It illustrates how ideology can be fragile when confronted by lived experience. By the end of these encounters, the soldiers were experiencing internal conflict, confusion, disbelief, and even admiration. Ideological certainties that had guided their understanding of the world were crumbling, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that Americans were neither weak nor decadent, but capable of generosity, empathy, and courage. The seeds of doubt planted here would grow steadily, challenging everything the POWs thought they knew about the enemy, and slowly reshaping their worldview. Once the initial surprise of being welcomed into American homes had passed, the POWs began to discuss their experiences in hushed conversations within the barracks. Small groups would gather at night, whispering about the contradictions they had encountered. "They smile at us as if we were guests, not enemies," one would murmur, shaking his head. Another added, "They give freely, without fear or suspicion. How can this be?" These discussions revealed a slow unraveling of the beliefs that had sustained them. Beliefs built on years of rigid propaganda, For the audience, this section provides an intimate window into the soldiers' minds. The conversations highlight the subtle psychological impact of humankind. It is not a single event but the accumulation of gestures, the shared meals, the casual laughter, the polite conversation that erodes certainty. Each POW brings his own experiences to the dialogue, comparing notes and expressing disbelief, embarrassment, and in some cases admiration. The emotional beat here is reflection. Viewers feel the tension as soldiers reconcile their upbringing and indoctrination with the reality of their situation. The intimacy of these whispered exchanges draws the audience in, creating empathy and curiosity. They sense the moral and intellectual conflict brewing in the POWs' minds, the struggle between loyalty to an ideology and acknowledgement of lived truth. By witnessing these internal debates, viewers begin to understand that true impact comes not from confrontation, but from the quiet subversion of expectation. The POWs' conversations become a microcosm of ideological collapse, showing that empathy and generosity can dismantle even the most deeply ingrained prejudices. By the 8th week of their captivity, the German POWs began to feel an unfamiliar weight pressing down on them, not the discomfort of confinement, but the quiet shock of comparison. Each day revealed details that contradicted every lesson taught by years of Nazi propaganda. Soldiers who had once believed themselves part of the most disciplined, powerful army, now stared stunned at the ordinariness of American life. The average factory worker owned cars and boots that would have been the envy of a German officer. Lunches were hearty, abundant and consistent. Even minor comforts, a clean shirt, a warm bed, a newspaper in hand, struck the POWs as luxuries beyond anything their families could hope for at home. The psychological impact was immediate and intense. Whispered conversations turned into silent stare. In the mess hall, soldiers would pause mid-bite, glancing around at tables piled high with bread, meat and milk. The collapse was not physical but mental, a deep, gut-level realization that their world's moral and material hierarchy had been inverted. For the audience, this section provides a powerful, visceral connection. They sense the disorientation and the creeping doubt that had begun to fracture the POW's confidence. Viewers witness the human toll of ideological dissonance. The emotional beat collapse anchors the narrative in the soldiers' inner lives. It is here, amid ordinary abundance, that propaganda dies quietly, replaced by awe, confusion, and a reluctant admiration for a system built not on fear but on routine generosity and the dignity of ordinary citizens. The stage is set for the next wave of transformation. As the POWs' minds bend under the weight of evidence, they are forced to reconsider everything they once believed about strength, power, and human decency. As December drew closer, the POWs found themselves invited to holiday celebrations in the very communities where they were held. At first, hesitation ruled. Soldiers trained to distrust, to expect hostility, were unsure if acceptance by strangers could be genuine. Yet American families opened their doors without hesitation. Long wooden tables groaned under the weight of cookies, cakes, roasted meats, and warm breads. Children ran about, laughing freely while choirs from local churches performed carols in the corners of sunlit rooms. The POWs watched in quiet disbelief, some unable to mask a nervous smile, others stealing glances at neighbors to confirm that this warmth was real. The scene became a lesson in humanity. Soldiers accustomed to scarcity and suspicion observed neighbors sharing freely, without expectation or reward. The air smelled of cinnamon, roasting turkey and pine from decorated trees, a sensory world so foreign that it seemed almost unreal. For the audience, this section builds a profound emotional connection. They sense the shock of the POWs, the surprise of joy infiltrating fear, and the gentle unraveling of preconceptions that had long defined their worldview. The emotional beat here, redemption spark, is subtle but powerful. It shows that human decency can pierce through rigid ideologies, that ordinary gestures like sharing a meal or singing together can reshape minds hardened by propaganda. In these shared moments, the POWs began to understand a different kind of strength, one built not on coercion or dominance, but on generosity, empathy, and trust. As laughter mingled with the soft hum of hymns, viewers witness a moral transformation take root, quietly signaling that the seeds of change are sown in ordinary heartfelt acts. The morning air was crisp and cold as the POWs were gathered to watch footage of the Normandy landing. On screen, hundreds of ships swarmed the coast, planes streaked across the sky, and thousands of soldiers poured onto the beaches. The POWs had witnessed America's abundance in food, comforts, and kindness, but this was an entirely different scale, a logistical ballet that defied comprehension. Every move was synchronized, every supply chain perfectly timed. The Americans' ability to coordinate men, machines, and materials left the German soldiers in stunned silence. For the viewers, this section emphasizes all the POWs' earlier disbelief at meals, gifts, and Sunday dinners now expanded into a recognition of global military and industrial might. The footage showed convoys moving across the countryside, tanks deploying with precision, and artillery firing in perfect coordination. These images triggered a profound realization. The same nation that had welcomed them to Sunday dinners and shared its Christmas treats could project power across oceans and continents with remarkable efficiency. The emotional beat overwhelm is built by juxtaposing small, intimate experiences with staggering military operations. Audiences are drawn into the POW's perspective, experiencing the same disorientation and marvel. There is a direct link between what they had been shown in local towns, the warmth, the generosity, the laughter, and this vast, organized capability. The viewer senses how the human-scale kindness mirrored a larger national competition. By the end of this segment, the POW's minds teetered on the edge of understanding a dual lesson. America was both compassionate and immensely powerful. The awe inspired by what they saw on screen was mirrored by the awe they felt in their encounters with families who had invited them to share in meals and celebration. The realization was complete. The United States combined heart and industry, and the POWs could no longer reconcile their former propaganda with the reality before them. After the awe-inspiring footage of D-Day and the scale of the Allied invasion, the POWs were directed to a different kind of screening, images and reports of concentration camps, liberated by American and Allied forces. The starkness of the scenes left no room for doubt. Rows of barracks, skeletal figures, and evidence of systematic deprivation confronted them. For the German soldiers, these were not abstract facts. They were a moral reckoning. The carefully constructed propaganda that had glorified the Reich and vilified America and its allies crumbled before their eyes. For the audience, this section delivers the emotional hammer. The POW's disbelief and shock mirrored what viewers feel when confronted with historical atrocities. A combination of horror, shame, and the gnawing realization of complicity by association, however distant. Their minds, already shaken by the abundance, kindness, and efficiency they had witnessed in America, now confronted the consequences of their nation's ideology. The contrast between their humane treatment and the suffering inflicted elsewhere was unbearable. Every small detail, the hollow eyes, the tattered clothes, the evidence of malnutrition, was a reminder that human life had been treated as expendable. The POWs struggled to reconcile the America they had encountered with the horrors their nation had unleashed. Each frame hammered the lesson home. Military might and propaganda could never erase the reality of human cruelty. By the end of the section, a profound emotional collapse had taken hold. The POWs' earlier arrogance, pride, and confidence were replaced with a mix of horror and shame, leaving them deeply reflective. For the audience, this moment underscores the moral gravity of war and the power of witnessing truth firsthand, ensuring the weight of history resonates long after the story concludes. As the war ended and the German POWs prepared to return home, they carried more than the physical memories of confinement. They carried stories, lessons, and profound impressions of human kindness. Among the most enduring of these were the Sunday dinners hosted by American families. Simple gestures, sharing a loaf of bread, serving fresh milk, offering a seat at the table, had etched themselves into their consciousness. For men who had been conditioned to view Americans as weak or decadent, these shared meals shattered every expectation. The journey home was not merely a return to familiar landscapes, but a passage laden with reflection. The POWs recalled the laughter around the dinner table, the warmth of conversations, and the way children offered them morsels with unguarded generosity. Every interaction was a lesson in empathy, humility, and the quiet power of generosity. These were memories that would travel with them, long after they had stepped off the transport trains and crossed the Atlantic. For the audience, this section sparks curiosity. How could such small acts leave such lasting impressions? By following the POW's perspective, viewers experience the dissonance between the war's brutality and these moments of connection. There is a gentle hopefulness here, an understanding that even in the midst of conflict, humanity can shine. The stories of shared meals become more than anecdotes. They become symbols of resilience, moral courage, and the potential for reconciliation. As they arrived in Germany, the POWs could not help but reflect on the lives they had glimpsed across the ocean, lives marked not by propaganda or force but by generosity and normalcy. For the audience, this section transitions the narrative from the horrors and shocks of war to the enduring impact of compassion, leaving a hopeful note that humanity can endure even in times of unimaginable strife. The simple act of inviting a former enemy to share a meal carried far-reaching implications that would resonate long after the POWs returned home. These Sunday dinners were more than hospitality, they were lessons in democracy, generosity, and moral courage. By witnessing that ordinary Americans treated them as humans rather than enemies, the POWs began to understand the true strength of a society built on empathy, trust, and shared responsibility. Each story they carried back became a testament to the quiet but profound power of democratic value. Unlike the propaganda they had grown up with, these meals revealed a culture where kindness was not conditional, where the ordinary citizen wielded influence through moral consistency, rather than sheer force. The Germans were stunned, not only by the abundance of food or comfort, but by the freedom and confidence with which these gestures were offered. To them this was a revelation: a society could project power, not only through armies or weapons, but through its everyday practices of care and community. For viewers, this section delivers closure and inspiration. The audience witnesses the full arc of the POW experience, from disbelief and shock to understanding and respect. These dinners are emblematic of a deeper truth, that democracy's hidden strength lies in the everyday decisions of ordinary people. The narrative emphasizes that lasting influence is not always measured in artillery or industrial might, but in the moral integrity and generosity demonstrated in simple moments. By the end of the chapter, the POW's legacy of observation transforms into an enduring message. Acts of ordinary kindness can leave indelible marks, challenge false narratives, and reshape perceptions across nations. The audience is left with a sense of uplift and redemption, reflecting on how humanity can flourish even in the darkest circumstances, and how small gestures can convey the most profound truths.